Hey people, welcome to Blue K Jazz Dancing the Blue Lab. I created a project called Dancing Spirit of Jazz. I created it in 1981 and I shared with people a saying, look before you leap. Manchester had a direct and indirect involvement in jazz's evolution. Jazz's birth and its evolution. People really have to have an understanding. The first city of modernism is Manchester. The North was the first cities that were first modernized through the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution in Manchester was the first ever in the world. Do you understand? And it influenced everywhere else. And it's important that people understand that. As an individual in 1981, I had developed my life through engaging in jazz and listening to jazz from a very, very young age. And derivative music is important. My father was in America from 55 to 61. He told me about what America was like. His father was in Cuba before my dad was born. Do you understand? I met a lot of individuals who were part of the modern jazz movement, or part of the cool jazz movement, and part of the swing jazz movement. My dad was born in 1935. My mum was born in 1942. What was seen as the key sort of elite music within the Caribbean culture and around the world was jazz. It was seen as this refined music that made people sophisticated, etc. But it was swing music. It's important for people to understand that was the music they danced to. So my mum went to jazz balls. Do you know what I'm saying? My dad knew about jazz, and they knew about that music was the music that influenced all music, pop music, everything that music that has come since jazz period, all came from the jazz era. Any derivative music, soul, disco, funk, all derived from jazz, and jazz musicians were involved in the evolution of the music, because when jazz lost its popularity, they were the musicians that were creating the new derivative music, which has not been acknowledged. But anyway, I created this project from 1981, and I myself documented my dance styles and everything. But what happened in 1991 was basically between 89, I had robberies at a dance in my dance lab in Bedford. I went there to study. I went there to create a school of dance, and it was all about personal development and professional development, because I've been involved in dance, and I used it for my personal development. I used it for my professional development. Do you understand? Dance to me I used in many different ways, and I wanted to create a school around that. I used it first and foremost for escapism. I used it for fun. I used it for play. I used it for games. I had a whole host of ways I used it, and it had a benefit. Number one benefit it actually improved my emotional intelligence, my self-confidence. It improved my positive self-image of myself. It gave me cultural grounding, because one of the key things about the dance itself, it led to me looking before I leapt. What it was, it broke stereotypes, because I was given stereotypes by the educational system that jazz was black jazz basically was inferior to Western music. But jazz influenced classical music, which was not identified to us at no time in educational terms, in my education. And I did a high level of music. Jazz influenced dance. It influenced the way people think. So DISJ is a practice, a way of learning, thinking and development. You know what I'm saying? And if you study the history of jazz from African great kingdoms to now, you'll see that what happens is it will change who you are, what you are. It will make you more improvisational, make you more spontaneous, make you more creative, make you more adaptable. And that's why I did Dancing Spirit of Jazz. And I introduced it to students and talked about what's the common denominator that we have no matter what happens. No matter where in the world, we all have been influenced by jazz, and our parents and our grandparents have been influenced by jazz. Jazz learning, thinking, development, and the era of jazz. When people think of jazz, you do think of sophistication. When you think of jazz, you think about human relationships is important. When you think about jazz, you think about humanity evolving to be bigger, better, and bolder, because that's one thing. When you think about jazz, you do think about miseducation. When you think about jazz, you think about stereotypes. You have to think of racism. You have to think about prejudices. You have to think of discriminations. You have to think of the KKK, Ku Klux Klan. You have to think of race relations. You have to think of the development of legal systems to enable people to be more free and have liberty, because slavery was part of bomb jazz development. We have to understand colonialization was part of jazz development, and fighting revolts against slavery and fights against colonialization. So when I started to give these lectures, basically part of it, I opened opportunities for us to explore issues in an unthreatening way using jazz. That's what I did. That's what DIJS was. Dancing Spirit of Jazz Leader Project talked about how I used jazz myself, the dance, the activities and development to improve my life skills, to improve my people skills, and that's what partly why I engaged in it. And when you look at the history of jazz, what did it do? A lot of people were lonely. A lot of people didn't have social skills, so they used the dance, the music, the activities to improve their social skills. If anybody talks about jazz, you go back and look into letters, look into the history. A lot of people said, yeah, I went to dance clubs because I wanted to improve my socializing. Because what happened, you have to understand, the Western society had made people repressed. The Western society, Victorian age, brought in certain types of education that wasn't profitable for the people at large. And what happened was they tried to kill the dance itself. You know what I'm saying? Germany tried to kill the dance and could not kill the dance. Why? Because the power of the dance, how it made people feel, the benefits that people gained from the dance wasn't going to stop them. And what happened was the dance symbolized, think about a dance in the world, a dance that means freedom and liberty. Think about it. Ballet doesn't mean that. Contemporary doesn't mean that. Modern dance doesn't mean that. Yeah? Tap dance means that. Vernacular jazz reflects liberty and freedom. Now, what happened was, in my period of growing up, when migrants from the West Indies came here and Africans and other cultures came here, a new jazz dance was created, which we call UK jazz dance, UK underground jazz dance. And one of the things I talked about was basically, before the DJs were playing the music, who spread this dance, underground jazz? The dancers did. The musicians did. Because the musicians were dancers and the dancers were musicians. They were artists and they spread the culture. They made it cool. You have to understand the history of the dancers, how the dancers were seen cool by a wider community and the musicians were seen as cool by the wider community. And they toured. They were touring the world before DJs became dominant. In the UK, there was dancers underground and there was musicians underground. How do I know? Because I studied under them. I studied under musicians. They had the records. They had the culture, they lived the culture and the lifestyle. So if you see the pictures of them in the past, the clothes that they wore, they've kept memorabilia. One of my teachers, Kwasi Asari, kept memorabilia of teachers, people that he played with in the 50s. Count Basie, do you know what I'm saying? Duke Ellington, Sun Ra. My teacher played with them. It was them that made it cool. And then what happened was, I'm a Dancing Spirit of Jazz leader. I then made it cool because I used to collect all the records. I used to collect the clothes. I used to collect magazines. Anything to do with jazz, I collected films. Then I started to move with other people that were lecturers. People had interest in films. I got films from them. I got tapes from them. It's from individuals. This is how this movement, UK Jazz, became cool. It wasn't from a DJ culture because it was about interacting with others and them seeing your culture. Listen to me what I'm saying. Seeing the culture of dancing spirit jazz. Seeing how you were. So I wore vintage clothes. And what people tried to do is make a joke about it. Tried to put me down and stereotype me. So what happens is I didn't pay attention to that because I had self-pride. So part of DISJ is having self-pride in your culture. Self-pride in your own creativity. And that's what I showed individuals. Do you know what I'm saying? I challenged stereotypes through the work I did in Europe. Through the work I did in education. Because I went on miraculously. It wasn't something I put into my book of development. I went on to be an educator. I expected to be a teacher of dance as part of my part-time. I wanted to be a dance teacher. Do you know what I'm saying? Within my community doing cabaret, but I never thought I'd be working in an educational setting across all educational levels, from primary school to nurseries to primary school to secondary school, talking about the dance that I created, pioneer of UK jazz dance. Talk about my own learning, talking about how it was important for me as a special education needs person, because I was written off as an individual, could not lead myself, lead others, and lead organizations, and I ended up through dance, because dance taught me to teach, dance taught me to direct, dance taught me to produce, dance taught me to motivate others to be involved in active activities, engaging in dance for their health, well-being and happiness. It involved me in projects, it involved me designing, creating projects, initiating projects, yeah, initiating festivals. I could so much went on with Dancing Spirit of Jazz, and Dancing Spirit of Jazz is about me reclaiming one of the projects I've created to reclaim my legacy. A book was written on UK jazz dance, and I was written out of it. My family's written out of it. My partner's written out of it. I'm the last dancer in Manchester, and one of the key individuals, the first educator, first researcher, the first preserver. I was written out of the book of UK jazz dance, and what happened was that was partly done deliberately, you have to understand, because the writers didn't want Manchester's prestige to really be known. And I knew that from a long time ago, because there was a few events that happened that were in the south of England that misrepresented us from the beginning, and that misrepresentation started from Absolute Beginners. The film did not perpetuate northern styles in the way that it should have done. It was disrespectful. They debased us. And what happened was, from 1986, Manchester lost its prestige. The JD still continued to do what they're doing, an amazing group, but they were lost. By 88, they did great things. They went to Japan. What happened? They had to import their art form, export the art form to Japan and Europe for them to continue, but they disbanded, unfortunately. What happened, part of my legacy is my staying power, because from the beginning, I identified that UK jazz dance was my culture, and it's different and it's unique. Every dancer has its own unique approach to learning, training and development. They have their own unique ideas. They had their own teachers they went to get their creative influences. They collect different records. So each dancer is inspired by different jazz music, etc. And we spread music, which is important, by tape, by records. I was posting records to people I met. I worked in record shops. I worked in a wholesalers, and I worked in record shop people. I never took any money ever. I always taught music. I took tapes, anything to do with jazz. That's what how I got my memorabilia, was working in record shops, people. I worked how to get my clothes, because I worked in shops. I worked in River Island, which was the first ever commercial development of vintage, and I worked in boutiques. I worked in vintage shops where, again, I didn't take money. I took clothes. I took key things around vintage in the shops. That's what I did. And I spread that to other people. I was one of them individuals that people came to my house. I had the jazz music, because my brother was 3 years older than me. Another brother 5 years older than me. My friends were all older than me. They had all the music as well. So I had a whole heap of tapes. And what I did as an individual, I used to make what is called, they used to call me master cut tape maker, because what I did, I got tapes from different friends and then made a master cut for my own practicing, and then introduced that to other people. I even took back tapes to other people and mixed their tapes, and people said, yo, where did you get that tape? I said, it was your tape, but I just put the music in a different order. So the point I'm really making was, each dancer hears music differently and they practice differently, so they need certain type of music. So my tapes were not only jazz, because it reflected the life I lived. Jazz, UK jazz dance didn't happen in a vacuum, and everybody's spoken about all the events that happen now basically around just having a jazz club. That's not how we had it in Manchester. We had soul, we had disco, we had funk, we had reggae, we had dub, we had lovers rock, we had calypso. We come from an intergenerational community. We never lived by ourselves, we lived with our parents. So in the household, what you hear? You hear the wide genre of music. You hear the derivative music of jazz, R&B, ska, you know what I'm saying? Reggae jazz, calypso jazz, country and western. That's how the jazz musicians themselves lived, because they were artists. Artists listen to a wide range of music. I listen to a wide range of music, and Dancing the Spirit of Jazz is about that. We listened to derivative music and other music that had nothing to do with jazz, but it was influencing jazz. We experimented with listening with experimental contemporary music. That led to me studying modern dance. That led me to studying contemporary jazz dance. It led to me into discovering experimental jazz dance music and theatre. It led me to Bauhaus. What you need to know as a dancer, I was an artist. You know, my dad's an artist. My brothers were all artists. I mean, visual artists. I studied art. I studied design. I studied interior design. I studied engineering design. These are all part of how Dancing the Spirit of Jazz. Go back to the period. Engineering was big in that period. Inventions was big in that period. So what happened? Dancers, musicians were studying other aspects. They were studying science. They were studying technology. They were studying philosophy. They were studying psychology, which is not actually been spoken about in the context of any event I've been to do debates or any book that's ever been written. does not talk about UK jazz dance from a social, physical, intellectual, cultural, emotional, political, economic, technological environment and legal. Doesn't talk about the climate of racism, the climate of optimism and hope, the climate of the dancers being academics, the dancers being artists, the dancers being activists, the dancers being ambassadors, the dancers being directors, the dancers being producers, the dancers going to dance school because they wanted to raise the prestige, the status and profile of dance from a educational perspective. I'm one of them. One of the people I worked with as a partner, Christopher Hibbert, did that also. Me and him went to another level because we studied African dance. Do you understand? Because we wanted people to understand, boom, where did the roots of UK jazz dance come from? We studied African dance. I studied Irish dance. I studied flamenco. I studied tango. I studied Brazilian dance, capoeira. I studied modern dance. I studied tap. I studied contemporary genres. I studied different types of ballet, different types of experimental dances that came out, Alexander Technique movement styles. People need to understand Alexander Technique was important. I studied yoga. I studied the era of Pilates. If people go back, you'll see that Joseph Pilates was around the 1930s. He influenced Martha Graham, the modern developers. They were looking at different ways to improve dance. So the people need to understand, when you look at contemporary dance, Pilates is in it. Yoga is in it. You don't understand. And different philosophies that people looked at, each pioneer dancer of dance, they had a philosophy, and they looked at Nietzsche, they looked at the I Ching and included it into dance. Now, Dancing in the Spirit of Jazz has its own philosophy, has its own physiology, and has its own psychology. Do you understand? Not noted, not spoken about. Why? Because the leading artists